Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space Channel. Tonight, the sobering and oddly clarifying truth about what life on Mars would actually be like for a human body. The popular picture of a future colony is gentle, almost cinematic domes, gardens, friendly red sunsets. The real picture is much harder. The next world out is, by almost every measure that matters for a living crew, brutally hostile in many directions at once. The radiation never stops. The air will not support a breath. The dust gets into everything. The silence between Mars and home stretches for minutes. Tonight we walk slowly, calmly, and honestly through the full catalogue of what stands between any of us and a comfortable life on Mars. If you find these explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who do. Thank you for being here. But for the next 2 hours, none of this is something you need to carry. Settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade away. Let's begin. Part 1. The place we are trying to reach. Tonight, the subject is brutal in a specific and measured sense. The next world out from our own is, by almost every standard that matters for a human body, an unsettling place to try to live. The brutality is not theatrical. It is not a single dramatic thread. It is a long, quiet catalogue of conditions, each one sufficient by itself to end an unprotected life, and most of which are present everywhere, on the surface, at all times. The picture the catalogue produces is sobering, and it is also, in its own way, calming. The hostility is not arbitrary. It is the long, honest consequence of physics and biology, and a planet that lost what it once had. The next world out is roughly half the diameter of our own, and about 1/10 its mass. Its surface gravity is approximately 38% of what a human body is used to. Its sky is faintly pink and orange. Its surface is cold and dry and dusty, scattered with the dry beds of ancient rivers that no longer flow. Its atmosphere is so thin that an unprotected human body would lose consciousness within seconds. Its temperatures range from cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide at the winter poles to mild only on the warmest equatorial afternoons. Its soil is laced with chemical compounds that disrupt the human thyroid and kill most candidate crop plants at the concentrations in which they occur. Its only source of breathable oxygen is the trace amount that must be manufactured from local resources by machines that do not yet exist at the scale a human crew would need. That is a sobering opening, and the rest of tonight will lay it out in detail. None of it is something you need to carry with you. Let it sit there, quietly, while we walk through it. The catalogue is long, and the pace will be slow. There is no urgency in any of it. The brutality has been there for billions of years. It will still be there in the morning. You can listen as long as you like and let go whenever you wish. We will start at the beginning with the simple geometry of trying to get there. The next world out-orbits the Sun at roughly 1.5 times the distance our own world does. Sunlight reaching its surface is less than half as bright as the sunlight at our own. The planet takes about 687 Earth days to complete one orbit, while our own world takes 365. Because the two planets move along orbits of different sizes at different speeds, the distance between them changes constantly. At their closest approach, an alignment astronomers call opposition, the two worlds can come within roughly 34 million miles of each other. At their farthest separation, with the Sun between them, they can lie more than 240 million miles apart. To send a spacecraft from one to the other in any fuel-efficient way requires waiting for a specific geometry. The geometry repeats roughly every 26 months, and the window it opens lasts only a few weeks. Missing the window means waiting more than 2 years for the next one. There is no working around this. The exponential nature of carrying fuel to lift fuel means that brute force does not help. Adding more propellant to force an unfavorable trajectory does not produce a faster crossing. It produces a heavier rocket that cannot lift itself. On the standard low-energy trajectory the planets allow, a one-way crossing takes between 6 and 9 months. Almost the entire crossing is not flying. It is coasting. The engines are largely off, and the spacecraft drifts along a long ellipse, bleeding slowly outward from the orbit of one world until it intersects the orbit of the next, at exactly the moment the next arrives at that point. There is no stopping. There is no turning around. There is no stepping outside. For 6 to 9 months, the crew sits inside a vehicle in deep silence, surrounded by their own air, their own water, their own food, and one another. That is the next world. That is the crossing. The rest of tonight is a long, slow, calm walk through what is waiting at the other end of it, and why getting there may be the hardest, sustained engineering and human challenge our species has ever attempted. Let your shoulders settle. Let your breathing slow. None of this requires your worry. It only requires your attention, gently, for as long as you wish to give it. The brutality begins, in a quiet way, before the crew ever leaves the ground. It begins in the simple arithmetic of mass. A rocket lifting itself off a planet must carry enough fuel to lift not only itself, but also the fuel that is doing the lifting. Each kilogram of fuel requires additional fuel to lift it, and that additional fuel has its own mass, requiring yet more fuel. The relationship is exponential. It is the central constraint of rocketry, and it has been the central constraint since the very first hand-calculated rocket equations more than a century ago. There is no workaround. The arithmetic does not bend. This is why the launch window matters so much. The favorable geometry is not a convenience. It is the only geometry that allows the crossing within the mass budget any plausible rocket can lift. A spacecraft launched in the right week, along the right arc, can drift to the next world on a reasonable amount of propellant. A spacecraft launched at the wrong time, even with the most powerful engines we have ever built, would arrive too slowly or with too little fuel left to do anything useful when it got there. The geometry decides. Once the crossing is underway, the spacecraft enters a long silence. The sun grows fainter behind it. The home world dwindles to a bright point and then to one star among many. There is no flowing past landscape. There are no clouds. There are no birds. There is only the slow, patient ellipse, the spacecraft and its crew suspended along its arc, neither still nor really moving by any measure they can feel. The longest single continuous human spaceflight on record is just over 437 days, set aboard a space station in low orbit around our own world in the middle 1990s. Every other long-duration mission in history has also taken place in low orbit, a few hundred miles above the home surface, in places where the crew could, in principle, have been evacuated within hours, where resupply vehicles arrived on a regular schedule, and where the world's best flight surgeons and mission engineers were in near real-time conversation with the crew the entire time. A crew on the way to the next world out would have none of those safety nets. They would have only what they brought with them and the long quiet ahead. That long quiet does things to the human body, and those things are the next part of the brutality. The human body is, in a deep biological sense, a machine built for a world that pulls on it. Every part of human physiology has been shaped over hundreds of millions of years of evolution by a constant downward force. The skeleton is built to hold weight. The muscles are built to push against gravity. The cardiovascular system is built to move blood upward against the slow pull. The vestibular system, the sense of balance inside the inner ear, is built around a known, steady, downward direction. Remove that downward pull, and the body begins, systematically, to take itself apart. The body does this for a calm physiological reason. Living tissue is expensive to maintain. Bones cost the body calcium and minerals. Muscles cost calories. The cardiovascular system costs continuous work. The body preserves what it uses and lets go of what it does not. In an environment that no longer makes demands on the skeleton begins to release its mineral mass. In an environment that no longer makes demands on the muscles begin to shrink. The body is not failing. It is simply doing what it has always done, in a place it was never built for. Bone density loss in long-duration crews runs at roughly 1 to 2% per month in the weight-bearing regions of the body, the lower spine, the hip, the long bone of the upper leg. After 6 months of microgravity, a returning crew member has measurably less bone in the regions of their skeleton that on the home world would be doing the daily work of standing and walking. Intensive rehabilitation can recover much of the lost density over months on the ground, but the process is neither fast nor always complete. Muscle atrophy follows the same pattern. The skeletal muscles that maintain posture and support movement, the legs, the lower back, the deep core, shrink measurably over weeks and months. Long-duration crews follow strict exercise protocols that occupy roughly 2 hours of every working day, specifically to slow this atrophy. Even with the protocols, measurable loss occurs. The body has decided, gently and patiently, that the muscle is no longer needed at its previous size, and it does not maintain it. The heart itself changes shape. In a microgravity environment, it gradually becomes more spherical because it no longer needs the slightly elongated geometry optimized for pumping against a vertical gradient. The walls of the heart adjust. The cardiovascular system as a whole reorganizes. Blood and the watery fluid that bathes the body's cells redistribute upward, away from the legs and toward the head, producing the characteristic full and slightly congested look that long-duration crews describe throughout their missions. Some of these changes carry deeper consequences than they first appear to. The cerebrospinal fluid, the clear protective fluid that surrounds the brain and runs down the spinal cord, also redistributes upward. The pressure of that fluid around the optic nerve, the cable of tissue that connects each eye to the back of the brain, gradually rises. Over months, that pressure transmits to the back of the eye. The back surface of the eyeball flattens slightly. The optic nerve develops a characteristic swelling visible on imaging. A meaningful fraction of long-duration crews return from space with vision that has measurably degraded. Some need corrective lenses they did not need before. For a crew arriving at the next world out, where every critical task depends on clear vision, reading instrument displays, evaluating equipment, navigating in a pressure suit, performing repairs, possibly performing medical procedures on a fellow crew member, any degradation of vision is not acceptable. The immune system also behaves differently in microgravity. Several immune functions become dysregulated. Latent viruses that lie dormant in most adult human bodies, including several members of the herpes family, reactivate and begin shedding at higher rates during long missions. The mechanisms are not yet fully understood. but the pattern has been documented consistently enough across multiple programs and decades to be taken as established. All of this physiological change accumulates during the crossing, before the crew has even landed. They arrive at the next world after 6 to 9 months of slow, patient bodily disassembly. They arrive in the most mechanically demanding phase of the entire mission. They arrive with weakened bones, smaller muscles, a reshaped heart, and a vestibular system that has to relearn what down feels like, all at once, on a world where help is months away. And the long quiet of the crossing is not only a quiet inside the body. It is also a quiet outside the body. The space between the two worlds is not empty. It is continuously crossed by streams of high-energy particles, and those particles are the next brutality in the catalogue. The space between any two planets in our system is filled with two distinct populations of high-energy particles, each of them a different kind of slow damage to a living crew. Part 2. The brutality of the crossing. The first population is solar in origin. The Sun, despite its calm appearance from the home world, is not a quiet star. It rotates differentially, twists its own magnetic field over decades, and periodically releases that twisted field in violent outbursts. Some of those outbursts take the form of solar flares, brief, brilliant pulses of energy that brighten a region of the Sun's surface across a wide range of wavelengths. Others take the form of coronal mass ejections, enormous slow expulsions of magnetized plasma that drift outward through the solar system in the days following an eruption. The most consequential outbursts produce intense bursts of high-energy protons that travel outward at a significant fraction of the speed of light. These bursts are called solar energetic particle events. For a spacecraft inside the magnetic field of the home world, the field deflects most of these particles before they reach the surface, and the few that get through are absorbed by the atmosphere. For a spacecraft outside that protection, drifting in the open space between two planets, the protons arrive almost unimpeded. A major solar energetic particle event delivered to an unshielded crew can produce acute radiation sickness within hours. A very large event could be fatal. The events are partially predictable. Networks of solar observatories monitor the Sun continuously and can detect the precursors and provide warnings on timescales of tens of minutes to a few hours. But they cannot be reliably forecast days in advance with the kind of confidence needed to plan mission activities around them. Every serious crewed spacecraft architecture for a crossing to the next world includes a dedicated radiation shelter. The shelter is usually a small inner chamber surrounded by water tanks, food stores, and other high-mass consumables that the crew can retreat into when a flare warning arrives. The thicker the shielding, the more protection the shelter provides. The water and the food are doing double duty, sustaining the crew on the long crossing and standing in the way of the next solar storm. The second population of particles is far stranger and far harder to deal with. Galactic cosmic rays are high-energy atomic nuclei from outside our solar system entirely. Many of them are protons, the simple, stripped nuclei of hydrogen atoms. A significant minority are heavier ions, the nuclei of iron and silicon and calcium and other heavy elements, accelerated to relativistic speeds by ancient supernova explosions and other violent processes distributed across the galaxy and beyond. Galactic cosmic rays carry so much kinetic energy that they penetrate almost any practical thickness of shielding. Worse, when they collide with the atomic nuclei of the shielding material, they produce cascades of secondary particles, showers of neutrons and pions, and other radiation products that add to the total dose absorbed by the crew rather than reducing it. Unless the shielding is thick enough to also stop the secondary cascades, The amount of mass required to substantially reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure is so large that no currently conceivable spacecraft could carry it. The homeworld's atmosphere is the equivalent of about 10 meters of water above each square meter of surface. Building a spacecraft with that much shielding is not possible. Carrying enough water to come close is not possible. The crew on a crossing absorbs cosmic radiation continuously, every hour of every day, for the entire duration. The actual numbers have been measured. A small radiation detector aboard one of the rovers that traveled to the next world out collected the most detailed data we have of what a human crew would actually experience along the same route. The dose received during the one-way crossing alone approaches or matches the lifetime career radiation limit that has historically been set for crewed missions in low orbit around the home world. A full mission, the outbound crossing, the months on the surface, and the return crossing would substantially exceed those historical limits under almost any realistic architecture. The health implications are real and well understood at the population level. There is an elevated lifetime risk of cancer, significant in absolute terms. There is also a less commonly discussed risk, more recently characterized, that may matter even more for the mission itself. The high-energy heavy ions in galactic cosmic rays deposit their energy in living tissue in a different way from conventional gamma rays or X-rays. When one of these heavy ions passes through a piece of biological tissue, it leaves a narrow track of dense ionization along its path. Where it passes through a neuron or through one of the slender connections between neurons, the damage can be structural in a way that resembles the cutting of a thread. Ground-based experiments using particle accelerators to simulate this kind of exposure in animal subjects have documented measurable impairments in spatial navigation, in cognitive flexibility, and in the consolidation of memory. The exposed animals were not simply sick. They were cognitively changed in specific, measurable ways. How directly this translates to a human crew on a long crossing is still under active research. What is clear is that the neurological risk is taken seriously enough to appear prominently in the medical risk calculus of every serious crewed mission plan. There is mitigation, and it is being actively developed. The most effective form of mitigation on the surface is simple mass, meters of soil or rock placed between the crew and the open sky. A habitat built underground, or covered with several meters of local soil, dramatically reduces both categories of radiation exposure for the crew members inside it. At sufficient depth, the combined radiation level inside a shielded habitat approaches the level we experience at sea level on our own home world. There is an option that may make this kind of shielding much easier to achieve than building it from scratch. The next world out has a long history of volcanic activity, and ancient lava once flowed beneath solidifying surface crusts in the same way it does on our own world. When the eruptions ended and the lava drained, the solid outer shells of those tunnels remained behind, leaving long hollow tubes of rock buried beneath the surface. Orbital radar and high-resolution imagery have identified numerous candidate openings into such tubes, and some estimates suggest individual tubes could be hundreds of meters in diameter and many kilometers in length. A pressurized habitat placed inside one of these tubes would be shielded from radiation by meters of surrounding rock thermally buffered against the extreme surface temperature swings and structurally protected against the occasional micrometeorite that punches through the thin atmosphere and reaches the surface. The tubes are, in principle, the most natural, ready-made habitat sites the next world has to offer. Whether any particular tube is actually structurally intact, accessible from the surface, and free of chemical or physical hazards is not yet known. Finding out requires missions specifically designed to survey and access them, missions that have not yet been planned, let alone flown. So the radiation environment is the second long, quiet brutality of the crossing and of the early surface stay. It is invisible. It cannot be felt. It does not announce itself. It is simply there, hour after hour, slowly accumulating in the tissues of the crew, with consequences that may stretch decades into the rest of their lives. The third brutality of the crossing is the one that arrives only at the end. The crossing itself, for all its dangers, is at least patient. The 7 minutes that decide whether the crew survives the arrival are not patient at all. The next world has an atmosphere, which means a descending spacecraft heats up dramatically during entry and must be protected by a heat shield. The atmosphere is thick enough to set things on fire. It is not thick enough to provide much help in slowing them down. The surface pressure is less than 1% of what we experience at sea level on the homeworld. Parachutes and aerodynamic drag together can slow a small, lightweight payload to a safe landing speed, and every successful robotic landing so far has used some combination of that approach. But for a crewed spacecraft, the scale of the payload is fundamentally different. A crewed lander must carry a habitat. It must carry life support for the duration of the surface stay. It must carry food and consumables for the crew. It must carry the equipment that will manufacture the return propellant from local resources. It must carry medical supplies, spare parts, scientific instruments, and the crew themselves. The total mass is on the order of 20 to 40 metric tons, possibly more depending on the architecture. No existing entry, descent, and landing system has come close to demonstrating the ability to land that much mass on the next world out. The leading proposed approach is propulsive descent. Instead of relying on parachutes to do the final slowing, the spacecraft fires its own engines during the last phase of descent, using its own thrust to bring the vehicle to a controlled touchdown. The physics of the approach is not in question. The engineering, making it reliable and autonomous and functional in the thin Martian atmosphere after a 9-month crossing, for a payload mass no one has ever attempted to land before, is a genuinely unsolved development challenge. The full sequence from orbital speed to a safe landing takes approximately 7 minutes. During those 7 minutes, the spacecraft is committed. There is no aborting the descent. There is no calling for help. The round-trip light travel time between the two worlds means that the entire sequence executes and completes before ground control on the homeworld even knows entry has started. Mission engineers sometimes refer to this stretch, informally, as the 7 minutes of terror, not because they are being theatrical, but because no one outside the spacecraft can intervene in any way during them. The crew and the spacecraft's autonomous systems are entirely on their own. The descent begins, the descent executes, and the descent ends before ground control knows anything has happened. If the systems work as designed, the spacecraft touches down softly on a chosen patch of dust and rock. The engines shut off. The crew sits inside, hearts pounding, listening to the faint sounds of the cooling structure around them, hearing for the first time the soft hiss of the thin alien wind against the outside of the vehicle. They have arrived. That is when the next chapter of the brutality begins. The surface itself, and the surface, in almost every measurable way, is harder on a living crew than the crossing was. A few additional details on the radiation environment of the crossing are worth sitting with for a moment, because they make the catalogue more concrete. The radiation a crew encounters in the open space between two planets is not a single thing. It is a constantly varying mixture of several different particle populations, each with its own energy distribution, its own biological effects, and its own pattern of arrival. The solar wind itself is the slowest and lowest energy component, It is a continuous stream of charged particles, mostly protons and electrons, that flow outward from the Sun's outer atmosphere in every direction at speeds of roughly 400 to 700 kilometers per second. Inside the homeworld's magnetic field, the solar wind is mostly deflected. Outside that field, it constantly washes over any object in interplanetary space. It is not, by itself, particularly dangerous to a shielded crew. Its energies are low enough that ordinary spacecraft walls deflect or absorb most of it. But it is the medium against which the more dangerous components are measured. Solar energetic particle events, the eruptions we have already discussed, are far higher in energy than the background solar wind. The protons they accelerate can reach energies of hundreds of millions of electron volts, far beyond what ordinary spacecraft walls can stop. A major event lasts hours to a few days. A very major event, of the kind that happens perhaps once every solar cycle, can produce particle fluxes thousands of times above the normal background for the duration of the event. The pattern of solar activity over time is partially predictable. The Sun runs through an approximately 11-year cycle of activity, with peaks of frequent flare events and quieter troughs. Even at solar minimum, however, occasional large events do occur. Mission planners cannot count on a quiet Sun for the entire duration of a crossing. The radiation shelter is not optional equipment. It is a required part of every serious crewed spacecraft design. Galactic cosmic rays, the second category we have discussed, are essentially constant in their flux at any given moment in the solar cycle, but their average level varies inversely with solar activity. When the Sun is most active, its expanded outer atmosphere and stronger magnetic field push outward through the solar system, deflecting incoming galactic cosmic rays at the periphery. When the Sun is quiet, fewer cosmic rays are deflected, and the average flux at any point in the solar system is higher. This means that a crew flying during a solar minimum, when the absence of large flare events is otherwise comforting, may actually receive more cumulative cosmic ray dose than a crew flying during an active phase. The biological effects of long-term exposure are still being characterized in detail. What is known, broadly, is that there is no clean threshold below which the radiation is harmless. Every additional dose is statistical, adding some small additional probability of long-term health effects. The total dose received over a long crossing and surface stay is substantial enough to matter in the lifetime risk calculations for the crew. The first crews to the next world will accept those risks knowingly after detailed personal briefings as part of their commitment to the mission. There is also the slower, more diffuse concern about chronic, low-dose neurological effects, particularly from the heavy ions in galactic cosmic rays. The ground-based animal studies that have characterized these effects use accelerator beams that simulate the kinds of particles a crew would encounter in space. The results are concerning enough that the question of cognitive impairment over the course of a long mission is a real part of the planning calculus, even though the exact extent of the effect in humans is not yet known, and may not be known with full confidence until human crews have actually flown the missions. It is worth pausing on this. Some of the items in tonight's catalogue are not yet known with full precision. The brutality includes a degree of honest uncertainty. The crews who go will go knowing that some of the risks they are accepting are not fully characterized, and that part of what they are accomplishing is the slow, careful characterization of those risks for the missions that will follow them. That, too, is part of the brutality. And that, too, is part of the work being done now. Part 3. The brutality of the surface. The surface of the next world out is more hostile to unaided human life than almost any environment on the home world that has ever supported a permanent human population. It is hostile in many directions at once, and most of those hostilities are present everywhere on the planet at all times, with very little local variation. Begin with the atmospheric pressure. The average surface pressure on the next world is approximately 610 pascals. That is roughly 0.6% of the sea level pressure at the surface of the home world. To put that in tangible terms, it is comparable to the air pressure at an altitude many times higher than the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner, and it is well below the threshold known as the Armstrong limit. Below the Armstrong limit, the water held within the soft tissues of the human body at body temperature begins to boil. The phenomenon is called ebulism, and it does not require contact with anything external. The water in the body simply starts to evaporate, in place, throughout the soft tissues, because the surrounding pressure is too low to hold it as a liquid. An unprotected human body on the surface of the next world out would suffer ebulism within seconds. Consciousness would be lost within roughly 10 to 15 seconds. Survivable exposure measured in minutes is not survival in any meaningful sense. This means that every minute of every day spent outside the habitat is a minute spent inside a pressure suit. The suit is, in effect, a portable atmosphere. It holds breathable air against the near vacuum outside. It is the thinnest possible barrier between a living human and a place where life as we know it cannot exist for more than a few seconds. The composition of that thin alien air is the next item in the catalogue. The atmosphere of the next world is roughly 95% carbon dioxide, with small amounts of nitrogen and argon, and only trace amounts of oxygen. There is no breathable oxygen at the surface. Every breath the crew takes for the entire duration of their stay must either be produced from local resources by life support equipment or carried from the home world at extraordinary expense. The temperature range is the next brutality. Surface temperatures on the next world span from roughly 143 degrees Celsius below zero at the winter poles, cold enough to freeze the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere onto the ground as a kind of seasonal dry ice snow, to perhaps 20 degrees Celsius above zero on the warmest equatorial afternoons. The average surface temperature is approximately 60 degrees Celsius below zero, colder than any place on the home world where humans have ever lived without active life support. The temperature also swings dramatically between day and night at any given location. The thin atmosphere holds very little heat, so the surface warms quickly when the sun rises and cools just as quickly when the sun sets. The diurnal swing, the difference between dayside and nightside temperatures at the same point on the surface, can be 60 to 70 degrees Celsius. That is a larger daily temperature swing than anywhere on the home world. A pressure suit must hold a living human body within a survivable thermal envelope across that range, every day, for years. The radiation environment is, as it was during the crossing, the next quiet hostility. The next world has no global magnetic field and only a thin atmosphere. Both of those things, a magnetic field and a thick atmosphere, are what protect life on the home world from the constant flux of high-energy particles from the sun and from the galaxy. Without that protection, the surface dose is many times higher than the dose at the surface of the home world. It is, however, lower than the dose during the crossing. The thin atmosphere does provide a little shielding. The planet itself blocks half the sky at any given moment, since the radiation from below is absorbed by the body of the planet itself. A crew member walking on the surface receives a significantly smaller dose per day than a crew member in open space along the same route. But the dose is still high enough that a long stay requires either substantial subsurface shielding or a strict surface time budget, with most of the day spent inside a shielded habitat and only carefully limited stretches spent outside on the open surface. The next quiet hostility is in the soil itself. The fine reddish dust and rock that covers the surface contains widespread chemical compounds known as perchlorates, at concentrations far higher than anywhere on the homeworld. Perchlorates are simple reactive chlorine compounds, and they have specific physiological effects on the human body. In particular, they interfere with the uptake of iodine by the thyroid gland, which can disrupt the hormonal regulation of metabolism. At the concentrations found on the surface of the next world, perchlorates are toxic to humans if introduced into the body in any substantial amount. They are also reactive enough to kill many candidate crop plants at the concentrations in which they occur in the local soil. This has practical consequences for daily life on the surface. Any dust tracked into the habitat is a contamination event. Airlocks must be designed not only to manage pressure, but also to remove contaminated dust from the outside of pressure suits before the crew passes back into the breathable interior. Any agricultural use of local soil requires either removing the perchlorates first, an energy-intensive chemical process, or amending the soil so heavily with organic material that the perchlorates are effectively diluted, or shifting to soil-free growing techniques entirely. The dust itself is the next item in the catalogue, and it is its own quiet brutality. The dust of the next world is extraordinarily fine. The average particle is much smaller than a grain of pollen, far smaller than the dust that settles in the corners of a room on the home world. It is also electrostatically charged. Combined with the absence of rain, these two properties mean that the dust clings to every surface it touches, and nothing washes it away. The dust gets into mechanical joints. It coats solar panels. It seeps into every airlock seal, every camera lens, every seam on every suit, every fitting on every connector. Managing dust is one of the central operational challenges of any long-duration surface mission. Equipment that performs flawlessly in a clean laboratory on the homeworld may degrade in ways no one anticipated when exposed to the daily, slow accumulation of charged perchlorate-bearing dust over months and years. The next world also experiences regional and occasionally planet-wide dust storms. A global storm can last weeks to months. During such a storm, the sunlight reaching the surface falls to a fraction of its normal level, which can have serious consequences for any system that depends on solar power. One long-running solar-powered rover, after nearly 15 years of operation, was finally silenced by a planet-wide dust storm that lasted long enough to deplete its batteries before sufficient sunlight could recharge them. For a crude habitat whose life support systems cannot pause, that scenario is an unacceptable single point of failure. The wind itself, despite what some popular depictions suggest, is not the danger. The thin atmosphere means that even a fast wind carries very little force. A storm wind of 100 kilometers per hour on the next world out exerts roughly the same physical pressure as a 10 kilometer per hour breeze on the home world. The wind does not knock anything over. It does not blow anyone off their feet. What it does is lift the dust, distribute it, and let it settle slowly into every crevice it can find. Above the dust, the next brutality. The next world has no significant equivalent of the home world's ozone layer, the high-altitude layer of triatomic oxygen that absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation before it reaches the ground. Without that absorbing layer, the ultraviolet flux reaching the surface of the next world is far higher than at the surface of the home world. This has implications for almost every material the crew will use. Equipment, suits, seals, plastics, electronic insulators, and any biological samples must be protected against ultraviolet degradation at intensities that would damage equipment certified for normal homeworld conditions within months. Anything left exposed on the surface for any length of time will degrade. Anything that depends on a particular surface coating, a particular polymer, a particular elastomer, will need to be either replaced periodically or shielded continuously. Now consider what daily life on this surface actually looks like in the slow, practical sense. A crew member preparing to leave the habitat begins the process well in advance. They check the weather. They check the radiation forecast. They check that the airlock is functional and that their suit is fully serviced. They put on a series of garments designed to manage the suit's internal environment. They climb into the suit itself, a complex multi-layer assembly of pressure-holding material, insulation, life support hardware, and protective outer layers. The suit must be donned slowly and carefully. A single misaligned seal could become a life-threatening leak on the surface. The helmet locks into place. The internal life support comes online. The suit begins regulating its own air, its own pressure, its own temperature, its own carbon dioxide removal. The crew member has, for the duration of the walk, become an extension of a small, portable spacecraft. They enter the airlock. The airlock pumps down, removing the breathable air from the chamber and venting it overboard, or, in more advanced systems, capturing it for reuse. The outer hatch opens onto the dust and the thin pink-orange light. The crew member steps out. The boots leave impressions in a regolith that has, in many places, not been disturbed for billions of years. Then they walk, slowly and deliberately, in the suit. Every motion is an effort. The stiff joints of the pressurized suit resist movement. The gloves, in particular, make fine manual tasks fatiguing. They work for some number of hours, perhaps 4 or 6, repairing equipment, deploying instruments, conducting whatever surface tasks the mission requires. They return to the airlock. They cycle through. They remove the suit carefully, brushing as much of the perchlorate dust off as possible before the inner hatch opens. They do this again the next day, and the day after, and the day after that, for months or years. There are no vacations. There is no stepping outside without the suit. There is no opening a window. There is no smell of grass or rain or any other living thing. The world outside is beautiful in its alien way, and it is also constantly trying, in a slow, patient way, to kill them. That is the brutality of simply being there. The catalogue continues into the slower hostilities of distance and silence. Part 4. The brutality of the silence. Distance is brutal in a way that does not show up on a map. The crew of a mission to the next world will live, for the entirety of their stay, inside a long delay. Every communication they have with anyone outside the small group of people in the habitat with them is shaped by the simple fact that radio signals, even traveling at the speed of light, cannot cross the distance between the two worlds quickly. The one-way travel time between the home world and the next world ranges from approximately 3 minutes, when the two planets are at closest approach, to approximately 22 minutes, when they are on opposite sides of the 5. Sun. A full round trip, a question and its answer, takes between 6 and 44 minutes. Depending on where the two worlds happen to be in their orbits at that moment. There is no real-time conversation possible. There is no chat. There is no back and forth in the ordinary sense. Every exchange is a series of long-delayed messages, each one sent into the silence and received minutes later. Each reply received minutes after that. The consequences for emergency response are stark. During a landing sequence, As we saw earlier, ground control on the home world cannot intervene at all. The descent begins, executes, and ends before Earth knows it has started. The same is true of every fast-moving emergency that might develop on the surface or inside the spacecraft. A pressure leak in the habitat must be diagnosed and managed by the crew from the moment it begins. A fire must be fought by the people in the room. A medical crisis must be addressed by whatever crew member has the most relevant training. A suit malfunction during a surface walk must be solved by the person in the suit with the help of the rest of the crew, in whatever time the situation allows. Ground control can be informed. Expert advice can be requested. But nothing useful can arrive in time to matter for any rapidly evolving situation. This is not a problem that better engineering can solve. It is a permanent operational characteristic of any mission to the next world out, set by the speed of light and the distance between the planets. The implication is that every critical system on the spacecraft and inside the habitat must be understood by at least one crew member, and ideally by several, in enough depth to diagnose and repair it under pressure, in the field, possibly inside a pressure suit, with whatever tools and spare parts are available at the time. The degree of autonomous capability required of a crew on the next world vastly exceeds anything required of any previous crewed mission in our history. The silence shapes the small things as well as the large. Every personal message home is a one-way recording, sent into the delay, received minutes later. Every reply is another one-way recording, traveling back across the same minutes. Conversations with family, with friends, with colleagues, with the ground teams supporting the mission, all take this form. There are no real-time exchanges with anyone outside the room. Over a multi-year mission, this remoteness reshapes how relationships are maintained, how the crew experiences their connection to the home world, and how the slow, patient psychological work of long-duration isolation is supported. It is not simply that the crew is far away. It is that the very texture of conversation, the back-and-forth interruption and response that ordinary human talk depends on, becomes impossible for the duration. The crew also experiences the silence in the other direction. They watch the home world dwindle to a bright point in the sky behind them. They watch the next world swell from a point of reddish light into a disk and finally into a landscape. They live for the entirety of the mission, in a place where every other living human being is reachable only through a delay. That kind of distance is not catastrophic. Humans have endured longer separations from family during other expeditions and wars. But it is sustained. It is constant. It is part of the operational background of every hour of every day, and for the small group of people inside the habitat, it shapes how they think, how they decide, how they support one another, and how they manage the slow accumulated weight of being far from home. The crew member who is going to fly to the next world out, who will look up at a small, bright blue point in the alien sky and know that everyone they have ever loved is on that point, is going to discover something about distance that nothing in our history has yet asked anyone to feel for that long. That is the brutality of the silence. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of the supplies. Everything the crew has, they brought. There is no resupply on the timescales that matter. The next launch window opens 26 months after the previous one. A supply ship dispatched today would not arrive for the better part of a year, and by the time it did, the situation it was intended to address would either have been resolved by the crew using what was on hand, or would have become something the crew could no longer be helped with. The numbers are unforgiving. A human being needs roughly 2 pounds of food per day to meet caloric and nutritional requirements. They need roughly 2 pounds of oxygen per day to breathe. They require several gallons of water per day for drinking, food preparation, and basic hygiene. For a small crew of 4 on a 500-day surface stay, the baseline food requirement alone exceeds 16,000 pounds. The proportional oxygen and water requirements stack on top of that. Carrying all of it from the home world is not feasible at the scale required for a long stay or for the indefinite presence of a growing colony. Every additional kilogram delivered to the next world out represents an enormous expenditure of energy and resources during launch, during the crossing, and during the descent. This means that any long-term presence on the next world is, by its nature, a presence that produces what it needs from local materials. The technical term for this is in situ resource utilization. It is not a desirable enhancement to a colonization architecture. It is a hard prerequisite for the existence of one. Without the ability to produce oxygen, water, food, and propellant from local resources, there is no path to permanence. There is only a series of extremely expensive temporary expeditions. The good news is that the resources, in principle, are there. The atmosphere of the next world is overwhelmingly carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the feedstock for a well-understood catalytic chemical process that combines it with hydrogen to produce methane and water vapor. The methane is an excellent rocket propellant, well suited to the next-generation engines being developed for crewed missions. The water vapor can be captured and split by an electric current into its component hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen recycles back into the reactor as feedstock for the next batch of methane production. The oxygen is breathable. This entire chain has been partially validated on the surface of the next world. A small instrument flew on one of the more recent rovers specifically to demonstrate that oxygen could be produced from the local atmosphere through electrochemical reduction of carbon dioxide. It worked. Across multiple operational runs, over more than a year of surface operations, it produced oxygen successfully from the local air. It produced oxygen, however, at a rate of roughly 6 to 10 grams per hour. A crew of 4 needs roughly 1 kilogram of oxygen per hour continuously, just for breathing. Scaling the demonstration by a factor of about 100, while making it reliable enough to operate without maintenance for years in the dust and cold of the surface, is the engineering challenge that separates a successful experiment from an operational life support system. The principle is proven. The full-scale system is not. The reaction also requires hydrogen as a feedstock, and hydrogen is not abundant in the local atmosphere. The primary potential source is water ice mixed into the subsurface soil at mid-latitude sites. Orbital instruments, including ground-penetrating radar and neutron spectrometers, have identified extensive subsurface water ice deposits across a wide range of latitudes. Extracting that ice requires drilling or excavating to the depth where it occurs, bringing the ice to the surface, melting it, and then splitting it electrically. Each step requires specialized equipment, careful operational planning, and a reliable energy supply. Food production is its own slow, practical problem. The local soil cannot be used directly for agriculture as it is. It lacks the organic matter, the nitrogen cycle biology, and the microbial diversity that healthy soil on the home world depends on. It is laced with the perchlorate compounds we discussed earlier, which would poison most candidate crops at the concentrations in which they occur. There are pathways forward. The perchlorates can be removed through chemical processing, although this is energy intensive. The soil can be heavily amended over many cycles with organic material until the perchlorates are effectively diluted and the microbial biology of healthy soil has been established. Or growing can shift to soil-free methods entirely, using hydroponic or aeroponic techniques that suspend the plant roots in nutrient-rich water or in a nutrient mist. The soil-free methods are well developed on the home world and have been tested in space environments. They sidestep the perchlorate and soil biology problems by eliminating soil from the system. The catch is light. Natural sunlight at the surface of the next world is, as we noted earlier, less than half as bright as it is on the home world, and a habitat shielded against radiation by meters of soil receives no direct sunlight at all. Crop production indoors requires high-intensity artificial lighting, which is a real and substantial draw on the colony's already finite power budget. Underneath every other system, on a base on the next world, is the power system. Life support, oxygen production, water extraction and processing, habitat heating and cooling, communications, food production, lighting, medical equipment, all of it runs on continuous electrical power. Without reliable continuous power, everything else fails. Solar power is the simplest initial option and has been used on every robotic surface mission so far. But the limitations are real. The next world receives roughly 40% of the solar energy that the same panel would receive on the home world. Dust accumulates on panel surfaces continuously, and because the dust is electrostatically charged and there is no rain to wash it away, the accumulation is persistent. During regional and global dust storms, the sunlight reaching the surface falls to a fraction of normal levels for weeks or months. For a crude base, where life support cannot be paused for weeks while waiting for a dust storm to clear, this vulnerability is unacceptable. Nuclear fission power is the answer that emerges from honest engineering analysis. A compact reactor provides consistent, reliable power regardless of sunlight, dust accumulation, season, or any other environmental variable. Its output depends only on its fuel load and its operational status. A small space-rated reactor design has successfully demonstrated its core concept in a ground-based nuclear test on the home world, operating at roughly 10 kilowatts. Scaling from that demonstration to the hundreds of kilowatts a crude base would require, and eventually to the megawatts a growing colony would need, is a substantial engineering program that has not yet been completed. Deploying nuclear reactors to another planet also involves regulatory frameworks, safety protocols, and launch safety analyses that extend well beyond the ground test. But the path is real. The chemistry is real. The physics is real. The engineering is being worked on right now by serious people in laboratories and test facilities on the home world, with the long, patient timeline of a project measured in decades rather than years. That is the brutality of the supplies, of the power, of the slow daily work of feeding a small group of people on a world that does not feed them. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of the inside of the head. Part 5. The brutality of isolation. The hardest variables in a mission to the next world out are not all physical. Some of them are inside the heads of the people who fly the mission, and those variables are documented well enough by analog research on the home world to be taken as serious operational concerns. A crew on the next world would be living in close, enclosed quarters with the same small group of people for years. They could not step outside without suiting up. They could not experience any aspect of the natural environment they evolved inside. No open air, no flowing water, no rain, no birdsong, no other living creatures beyond themselves and whatever crops they managed to grow. Every communication with anyone outside the room would be delayed by minutes. Every day would look much like the day before. Research on long-duration, isolated and confined environments on the home world has built up a careful picture of what this kind of existence does to the people inside it. Antarctic winter-over cruise. Small groups of scientists and support personnel who remain at high-latitude research stations through the 9-month austral winter, when no aircraft can arrive or depart, consistently develop measurable cognitive changes over the course of the season. Processing speed slows. Spatial cognition becomes impaired. Mood dysregulation deepens as the isolation continues. Submarine personnel, long-duration polar expedition members, oilfield workers in remote stations, and participants in controlled isolation studies show similar patterns. These effects are not signs of weakness in the personnel. They appear consistently across well-selected and well-trained populations. They appear to be ordinary consequences of long enclosed life in small groups. Long-duration habitat simulations have produced even more detailed data. One program placed crews in isolated dome habitats on the slope of a volcano for stretches of up to a year, simulating many of the conditions of a long surface stay on another world. Another large-scale program in a different country sealed a crew of 6 inside a habitat for more than 500 days, simulating the full duration of a round trip to the next world out, including communication delays. Both programs documented patterns of interpersonal conflict, motivation, degradation, and cognitive performance changes that mission planners now treat as operational variables to plan around. These effects occurred despite the fact that the participants always knew they were on the home world. They knew that rescue was possible in a genuine emergency. They knew that the doors could, in principle, be opened. A crew on the next world would face a longer confinement than any of these analogues, with a smaller crew in a smaller habitat, with no possibility of evacuation whatsoever. They would face it with the constant background awareness that inattention to a suit seal or a meter reading could end everything for everyone. There is also the slow weight of what cannot be touched. A crew member on the next world would go entire years without the sensation of wind on bare skin, without the smell of rain, without the sound of leaves in a breeze, without the sight of a horizon that is not also a piece of geology. The visual field outside the habitat would be predominantly reddish and grey. The sounds outside the habitat would be muffled by the thin atmosphere and the suit. The world they evolved inside would be visible only as a small, bright point in the sky overhead, mostly indistinguishable from a star. This is not a problem to be solved. It is part of the conditions of being there. It can be supported. It can be lived inside. It cannot be removed. Crew selection for a mission to the next world will be one of the most demanding selection processes ever designed. Technical competence is necessary, but not sufficient. Physical fitness is necessary, but not sufficient. Psychological resilience of a specific kind is required, a resilience that has less to do with the absence of difficult emotion than with the capacity to process difficult emotion without dysfunction, to maintain interpersonal patience under sustained stress, to make sound decisions under conditions of fatigue and uncertainty and incomplete information. Research on what predicts success in long-duration isolated and confined environments consistently points away from the kind of dramatic individual heroism that popular culture tends to celebrate. The people who do best in these environments are not necessarily the most impressive in any conventional sense. They are the people who maintain their routines when motivation fails. They are the people who manage their own emotional states without burdening others. They are the people who remain genuinely curious and genuinely useful at the far end of month 11 inside a small enclosed space. Those traits are partly innate and partly trained, and identifying them reliably in advance is one of the most important and least well understood challenges in long-duration mission planning. The selection process for the first crew to the next world will be one of the most consequential decisions any space program has ever made. Get it wrong, and the most expensive and dangerous human expedition in our history fails, not for a technical reason, but for a human one. Get it right, and the crew becomes not only the people who first walk on the next world, but the people who prove the long, quiet work can be done, and who demonstrate to everyone who comes after them that the barriers are real but not infinite. Inside the habitat, daily life would settle into the patient rhythms of a small, high-stakes household. There would be schedules for work, for meals, for exercise, for sleep, for personal time, for crew meetings, for one-on-one check-ins with the mission's psychological support team. There would be carefully maintained traditions, small markers of holidays from the home world, observed in the small group inside the dome on the next world. There would be celebrations of personal milestones, birthdays observed, anniversaries marked, the small acts of acknowledgement that small isolated groups have always developed to remind themselves of their shared humanity. There would also be friction. It is not realistic to imagine that 6 or 8 people sealed inside a small habitat for years would never grate on one another. Even the best selected crews under the best conditions experience interpersonal tension over long durations. The discipline of long-duration confinement is not the absence of friction. It is the practiced ability to manage friction quickly, repair small ruptures before they become large ones, and maintain the patient cooperation that the life of the group depends on. The role of the crew physician, the crew psychologist, the crew leader, and indeed every individual member of the crew in maintaining that patient cooperation is one of the central skills of long-duration spaceflight. It is not a skill that is widely taught on the home world, because almost no environment on the home world demands it at the same intensity. It is being slowly learned, mission by mission, year by year, on the orbital station and in the analog programs, and the lessons being learned there will become the foundation of crew operations on the next world. The brutality of the isolation, in the end, is not that it is intolerable. It is that it is sustained. It is constant. It is part of the operational background of every hour of every day for 2.5 to 3 years. The hostility of the place is matched by the long, quiet wait of being far inside it. That is the brutality of the inside of the head. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of having to be one's own emergency room. There is no calling for an ambulance on the next world. There is no evacuating a patient to a hospital. There is no consulting a specialist in real time. The crew's training, their onboard medical kit, and whatever delayed telemedicine guidance they can obtain through the communication lag are the totality of the available medical resources. The honest implication of this is that some conditions which would be routinely survivable at any hospital on the home world would not be survivable on the early next world. A burst appendix at a major hospital is, in nearly every case, a treatable surgical emergency. A burst appendix on the surface of the next world is a serious medical situation that the crew would have to manage with whatever surgical capability they brought with them, by whatever crew member has the best training in abdominal procedures, in conditions of partial gravity, with no possibility of evacuation. Mission planners do not pretend otherwise. They build the medical kit, they train the crew, they include redundancy where they can, and they accept that there is a category of medical event for which there will not be a satisfactory answer. This is not a problem that more equipment can fully solve. It is a property of distance and time. Early crews to the next world will include at least one crew member with extensive medical training that goes well beyond standard first aid, ideally including surgical training, critical care skills, and advanced diagnostic capability. They will carry the most carefully selected medical kit that the available mass and volume allow. They will have access to automated diagnostic tools and remote surgical guidance systems that are active areas of research and development right now on the home world, in the laboratories of engineers and physicians, thinking carefully about how to extend the capabilities of a small isolated crew. But the realistic ceiling of medical care in an early habitat on the next world is below what modern emergency medicine on the home world can provide, and it will be below that ceiling for many years. The first crews will know this. They will go anyway, because what they are attempting is worth the risk. They will also know that part of what makes them suitable for the mission is the specific kind of practical calm that allows a person to face a serious medical situation, recognize it for what it is, and make the best of the available options without panic and without despair. That is the brutality of being one's own emergency room. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of having to wait on the surface until the planets line up to allow a return home. A few additional notes on the long quiet of the isolation are worth sitting with, because they tell us something specific about what the daily experience inside the habitat is likely to feel like. The crew on the next world will, every day, look out their windows at a landscape that is fundamentally other. The light is different. The colors are different. The horizon is closer than the horizon on the home world because the planet is smaller. The sky is faint pink-orange in the daytime and dark with a different pattern of stars at night. There is no green. There is no blue. There is nothing growing outside the habitat. There are no clouds in any familiar form. There are no birds. There are no insects. There is no rain. There is the slow movement of dust on the wind. There is the slow progression of shadows across the surface as the sun moves. There is the slow change in the angle of the light from one season to the next as the planet's axial tilt carries the local hemisphere through its long alien year. None of this is unbeautiful. Many of the people who have spent the most time studying the next world describe it as quietly astonishing, an alien landscape with its own kind of stark elegance. But none of it is the world the crew evolved inside. The interior of the habitat will, by deliberate design, contain pieces of the home world. There will be plants growing under artificial lights in the agricultural module, providing some greenery and some living biological presence. There will be small personal items the crew brought with them. There will be music, recorded long ago on the home world, played softly inside the habitat at chosen times of day. There will be photographs. There will be saved messages from family and friends, watched and rewatched across the long months. These things will matter. The literature on long-duration isolation consistently emphasizes the importance of small markers of normality, the simple acts of acknowledgement that long-isolated groups have always developed to maintain their sense of continuity with the broader world. Holidays will be observed. Birthdays will be celebrated. The arrival of a new orbital photograph from the home world will be greeted with attention. The departure of a particular constellation behind the western horizon for the alien season will be marked. The crew physician and the crew psychologist will, in addition to their ordinary medical responsibilities, be the people whose attention is most carefully focused on the slow patient maintenance of the crew's emotional well-being over the years. They will watch for the early signs of trouble. They will encourage the crew to maintain their routines. They will listen carefully to the slow accumulation of small frustrations that long enclosed groups always develop. They will help repair small ruptures before they become large ones. The role of the mission's psychological support team on the home world will be similarly slow and patient. They will exchange long-delayed messages with the crew. They will listen to recorded check-ins. They will provide, through the long lag, the perspective of an outside ear that the crew themselves cannot give one another. They will be, in a real sense, the crew's connection to the world they came from and to which they intend to return. None of this is glamorous. None of it makes headlines. All of it is the slow, patient work of keeping a small group of human beings functional, capable, and emotionally intact across 2.5 to 3 years of isolation that no analog on the home world can fully match. The crews who do this well will, when they return, become the first generation of people who have shown that it can be done. They will pass on what they have learned. The crews who come after them will build on that learning. Slowly, over decades, the discipline of long-duration deep space crew operations will become a real, taught, transmitted body of knowledge. It is not that body of knowledge yet. It is being assembled now, mission by mission, year by year, in the analog programs and aboard the orbital station, and in the careful research of psychologists and physicians who have spent their careers thinking about what isolation does to human beings. That body of knowledge is itself part of what the brutality is producing. The hard problem is forcing the discipline. The discipline, slowly, is becoming a real thing. And every piece of the discipline that is being built now will be available to the crews who go later. That, too, is part of the slow, patient picture. That, too, is part of what makes the work worth doing. Part 6. The brutality of waiting to come home. Once a crew has landed on the surface of the next world, they cannot simply leave. The same orbital geometry that constrains the outbound crossing also locks in the return. The two planets, continuously moving along orbits of different sizes at different speeds, do not present a favorable return geometry every day. They present one only once per 26-month launch window cycle, the same cycle that governs the outbound trip. In the mission architectures that have been most carefully studied, a crew that lands on the next world must remain on the surface for approximately 500 days before the orbital geometry allows a return trajectory with acceptable propellant requirements. This waiting period is not a planning choice. It is a consequence of the planets themselves. Land just before the window opens, and the wait is short. Land just after the window has closed, and the wait is long. Either way, the wait is not optional. This means that a crew is committed, the moment they land, to a stay measured in years on a world whose hostility we have spent the last few hours cataloguing. There is no shortened mission. There is no calling it off early. There is no emergency early return, except in the most degraded form, an emergency dash that would arrive home in worse condition than waiting the full window through. During those 500 days, the crew lives on the surface, conducts the work of the mission, maintains the habitat and its systems, eats food grown by their own equipment or carried with them from the home world, breathes oxygen produced by their own life support hardware, drinks water that has either been carried or extracted from the subsurface ice, and waits. The waiting is, in its own quiet way, part of the brutality. It is also part of what makes the work possible. 500 days is enough time to do real science, to set up real infrastructure, to test life support systems against the slow accumulated weight of routine operation, to learn what works and what does not, to build the foundation that the next mission and the one after that will build on. At the end of those 500 days, the crew must launch. The ascent vehicle, the small rocket that will lift them from the surface back to orbit, must function reliably after sitting on the surface for more than a year, exposed to the dust and cold and ultraviolet of the open environment the whole time. The launch must succeed on its first attempt. There is no recovery option if it fails. In the most carefully designed architectures, that ascent vehicle has been pre-deployed by a prior uncrewed mission. It has been sitting on the surface for years before the crew arrives, sealed against the environment as well as possible, with its propellant either delivered or, more commonly in modern proposals, manufactured on the surface itself from local resources. The chemistry is the same chemistry we discussed earlier. Carbon dioxide from the local atmosphere is combined with hydrogen extracted from local water ice in a catalytic reactor, producing methane as fuel and water vapor that can be split into oxygen for the engines. By the time the crew arrives, the ascent vehicle's tanks should be full. The verification of all of this, the operational confirmation that the propellant plant has worked correctly for the months required to fill the tanks, that the ascent vehicle is healthy, that all the systems will function on launch day, is the precondition for the crew leaving the home world in the first place. No serious mission plan sends a crew on a one-way crossing without first verifying that the means of return are already waiting on the far side. The pre-deployment of critical infrastructure is the foundation of the safety case. Pre-deployment is central to every serious architecture for a long stay on the next world. Send the hardware first, verify it works, then send the people. The logic is sound from a risk management perspective. The catch is that every element of the pre-deployed infrastructure must survive the interplanetary crossing, survive entry, descent, and landing, and operate reliably on the surface for months to years while awaiting the crew without any possibility of maintenance or repair during that wait. When the ascent vehicle finally lifts the crew off the surface, they enter orbit around the next world for the second time, this time outbound. In the most common architectures, they rendezvous with the larger Earth return vehicle that has been waiting in orbit since the crew arrived. They transfer aboard. They settle in for the second long crossing of the mission. The return crossing, like the outbound crossing, takes 6 to 9 months. The same physiological vulnerabilities apply. The crew, already weakened by their long stay on the surface, faces another long stretch of microgravity. The radiation continues to accumulate. The same silence stretches behind them, and now the home world swells slowly in the windows ahead of them, a small bright blue point that grows over months into a recognizable disk, and finally, on the last day, into a place again. The total mission duration from the moment of launch from the home world to the moment of arrival back at it is approximately 2.5 to 3 years. It is one of the longest sustained operational commitments any group of human beings has ever undertaken. It is the entire arc of their professional lives concentrated into a single mission. That is the brutality of the schedule. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of what the crew wears every time they leave the habitat. The pressure suit is not a peripheral piece of equipment. It is the most critical single piece of hardware that a crew member depends on every time they step outside. It is, in effect, a wearable spacecraft. It is a sealed pressure vessel containing a human body. Every joint must allow movement without leaking. Every seal must hold against the pressure differential between the inside of the suit and the near vacuum outside. Every connection point between the suit and the life support hardware must function continuously for hours at a time, in the dust and the cold and the ultraviolet of the open surface. A suit for the next world must do many things simultaneously. It must maintain an internal pressure high enough to keep the wearer alive. It must allow enough joint mobility for sustained physical work, bending, kneeling, climbing, lifting, in partial gravity, for hours. It must provide gloves with enough manual dexterity to allow the crew member to perform detailed mechanical work, repair instruments, manipulate small components, operate tools, while also holding pressure against the vacuum on the outside. Current spacesuit gloves are the subject of consistent complaints from the people who use them. They are stiff. They are fatiguing. They limit fine motor control compared to bare hands. For a mission that will require detailed equipment manipulation across years of routine surface operations, these limitations have real operational consequences. Every task takes longer in a suit. Every fitting takes more attention. Every adjustment that would be trivial in shirt sleeves becomes an exercise in patience inside the suit. The suit must also provide adequate thermal insulation across the temperature swings of the surface day. It must protect against the ultraviolet flux at the surface. It must manage the dust problem, ensuring that contaminated dust adhering to the outside of the suit does not enter the habitat when the crew member returns. Airlocks and decontamination procedures must be designed to prevent dust from being tracked inside, and the suit itself must be maintained in a way that prevents the slow accumulation of perchlorate contamination in its joints and seals. Current and recent spacesuits were designed primarily for use in the microgravity environment of low-orbit stations, or for limited-duration surface operations on the Moon. Developing a suit that meets the specific requirements of sustained daily use in the dusty, radiation-exposed, thermally extreme environment of the next world across years of operation is a significant development program in its own right. The suit that the first crew on the next world will wear does not yet exist. It is being designed. It is being prototyped. It will be tested in analog environments and on the lunar surface in the years ahead. But the final suit, the one that will actually be there when the crew steps out for the first time, has not yet been built. That is the brutality of the suit. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality of the habitat itself. The habitat is the volume inside which the crew will live, work, sleep, eat, exercise, and recover for 2.5 to 3 years. It is the place where they will spend almost every hour of every day that is not spent on the surface. It must do, simultaneously, an enormous range of things. It must hold pressure at a level that keeps the crew alive and comfortable. Full homeworld atmospheric pressure is the conservative approach. It requires no physiological adaptation. It allows normal equipment design. It eliminates the decompression concerns that come with operating at reduced pressure. But full atmospheric pressure also requires more robust structural design because the pressure differential between inside and outside is larger, with roughly the equivalent of one homeworld atmosphere of overpressure pushing outward on every surface of the habitat. Some mission architectures have proposed operating at reduced pressure, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of homeworld sea level pressure, with a higher fraction of oxygen to compensate. This reduces the structural mass requirements of the habitat at the cost of an increased fire risk from the higher oxygen fraction, and at the cost of the crew having to adapt physiologically to the lower pressure environment for the duration of the stay. The habitat must be thermally insulated against the surface temperature swings. The walls must hold heat against outside temperatures that can fall to 80 degrees Celsius below zero at night, while also managing the heat generated inside the habitat by the crew, by the equipment, by the lights, by the cooking and exercise and life support hardware. Thermal management is not a small problem. It is one of the largest continuous engineering loads on the habitat's systems. The habitat must be radiation shielded for long-term occupants. This either means constructing the habitat with radiation-absorbing materials, adding mass proportional to the shielding level required, or covering the habitat with local soil after it lands. Soil covering is by far the more mass-efficient approach. It requires robotic equipment to excavate, transport, and pile the soil over and around the habitat in the weeks before the crew arrives. The robotic equipment has to be delivered, set up, and operated successfully on a body where every step is its own engineering challenge. The habitat must be large enough for the crew to live in it for years, without the psychological consequences of severe confinement becoming mission-threatening, while also being small enough that it can be delivered to the next world within practical payload mass limits. The smallest habitats that can be realistically transported on near-term vehicles are genuinely cramped by any objective measure. Expanding them through inflatable modules or additional landed hardware requires multiple missions and complex assembly operations on the surface. And the habitat must support all the functions of daily life and work for years without significant external input. Food preparation, personal hygiene, waste management, exercise, sleep, medical care, scientific work, equipment maintenance, communications. All of it must be accommodated in a space that, for the earliest missions, is likely measured in tens rather than hundreds of square meters of floor area per crew member. Waste management is a specific operational challenge that is easy to overlook but is critical in a closed habitat environment. On the home world, waste management is invisible infrastructure. On the next world, everything that enters the habitat as food, oxygen, and water must eventually exit as waste in one form or another, and all of that waste must be managed within the habitat system. Water reclamation from urine and other wastewater is a technology that has already been developed for orbital station operations. Current systems recover approximately 90% of water from urine through a combination of distillation and filtration. On the next world, even higher recovery rates would be needed over time, as resupply becomes infrequent and eventually impossible. Solid waste must be managed without contaminating the habitat environment. The volume generated by a small crew over a 500-day stay is substantial. Carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew must be removed continuously from the habitat atmosphere, efficiently and without fail. The orbital station uses a system that absorbs carbon dioxide in chemical scrubbers and vents the captured gas overboard. On the next world, that captured carbon dioxide could instead be fed back into the propellant and oxygen reactor, closing the loop more completely and turning the crew's exhalations into part of the resource cycle that keeps them alive. The engineering of a fully closed-loop atmosphere management system that handles carbon dioxide, water vapor, oxygen, nitrogen, and trace contaminants reliably for years is a substantial technical challenge. It is being addressed in research programs on the home world. It has not yet been fully demonstrated at the scale and duration that a long surface mission would require. That is the brutality of the habitat. The next item in the catalogue is the slower brutality of the planet's own long history. Part 7. The brutality of the story the planet tells. There is a slower, quieter brutality underneath all the others. The next world out, today, is hostile. It was not always. The slow, patient accumulation of evidence from multiple orbiters and the long-running rovers has built up a picture of an ancient version of the planet that was very different from the version we are trying to reach. Once, the surface had liquid water. Once, the atmosphere was thicker. Once, there was a global magnetic field generated by a churning iron core, a magnetic shield much like the one the homeworld still has today. The geological record on the surface is unambiguous on this point. There are ancient river valleys, kilometers long, with the unmistakable shape of channels carved by flowing water. There are outflow channels that suggest catastrophic floods once released volumes of water that would have temporarily filled seas. There are layered sedimentary deposits that could only have formed in standing water over long periods. There are minerals on the surface, certain forms of clay, certain hydrated salts, that on the homeworld form only in the presence of liquid water over thousands to millions of years. The rovers have walked through these places. One of them spent more than a decade exploring the floor of an ancient crater that held a standing lake. Another has been working through the sediments of an ancient river delta in a crater that opened into what was once a large body of water. The story they are telling, in slow, careful detail, is the story of a planet that was once warm enough, wet enough, and chemically rich enough to be the kind of place where life on the homeworld started. What we do not yet know is whether life ever began there. The question is among the most profound, open questions in science. A small sample return mission has been collecting carefully chosen pieces of rock and soil from the bed of that ancient lake, sealing them in special tubes and depositing them in marked caches on the surface for eventual retrieval. The retrieval mission, the long, careful effort to bring those samples back to laboratories on the homeworld for the kind of analysis that no rover can perform on the surface, is one of the most anticipated scientific projects of our era. What we do know is that the warm, wet, ancient version of the next world did not last. Something happened, slowly, over billions of years, that turned it into the cold, thin, dry place it is today. The story, as best we currently understand it, begins inside the planet. The deep interior of any rocky world is a place of slow, churning convection, hot material rising from below, cooler material sinking from above, and on the home world, that churning, combined with the planet's rotation, generates the global magnetic field that surrounds us. The next world also once had such a field. The evidence is in the magnetic patterns frozen into the oldest rocks of the surface, traces of a magnetic environment that no longer exists. At some point, billions of years ago, that internal dynamo shut down. The reasons are still being actively studied. The next world is smaller than the home world, and smaller worlds cool faster because they have less internal heat in proportion to their surface area. As the interior cooled, the convection that drove the dynamo may have weakened until it could no longer sustain a planetary field. Whatever the precise mechanism, the field that had once surrounded the planet faded. Without that magnetic shield, the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles that flows outward from the sun in every direction, began to interact directly with the upper atmosphere of the planet. Over hundreds of millions of years, that interaction stripped the atmosphere away, layer by layer. Charged particles in the upper atmosphere were accelerated by the solar wind to escape velocity and lost to space. The atmosphere thinned. The surface pressure fell. Water that had been stable as a liquid at the surface became unstable, evaporating in some places, freezing in others, escaping to space in still others. What remained froze into the polar caps or vanished into the subsurface as buried water ice. The atmosphere stabilized at the thin, cold-thin envelope that now wraps the planet. The surface became the cold, dry, dusty world the rovers have explored. This is the deep story of why the next world out is brutal today. It is not arbitrary. It is not a planet that was simply built badly. It is a planet that was, for a long stretch of its history, a place where life as we understand it could, in principle, have begun and persisted, and which then slowly lost the conditions that supported it. The brutality is the long, honest consequence of that loss. Every danger the crew will face on the surface, the thin air, the radiation, the cold, the dryness, the dust, the perchlorate chemistry, is in some sense a direct consequence of that ancient shutdown. The magnetic field that once protected the planet from the solar wind no longer protects it. The atmosphere that once held the surface warm and stable is gone. The water that once flowed across the surface is locked away. The conditions that the rovers walked through, the conditions that the first human crews will walk through, are the conditions left behind after a long unwinding. There is something quietly sobering in this. It is not the kind of sobering that wakes anyone up. It is the kind of sobering that comes from sitting with a long, honest history. The next world out is brutal because it lost what it once had. The home world is gentle because it has not, yet, lost what it has. Two worlds, one outcome each, born of the same kind of slow internal physics, different only in mass and distance and the patience of the field that surrounds them. The crew that lands on the next world will walk through that history every day. They will see the dry beds of vanished rivers from the windows of their habitat. They will scoop their feedstock of water ice from buried layers that froze into the ground when the atmosphere thinned. They will breathe air manufactured by their own equipment because there is no breathable air left. They will live, in a real sense, in the long, quiet aftermath of a planet's slow loss. That is the brutality of the story the planet tells. The next item in the catalogue is the brutality the next world reserves for the future, for the generations that will follow the first crews if the colony grows beyond its first decades. A long-term presence on the next world means, eventually, children born on the next world. Not flown there as adults. Not selected as crew. Born there, raised there, shaped there from infancy. A human being raised entirely in roughly 38% of the home world's gravity will develop differently from a human being raised on the home world. The bones, the cardiovascular system, the musculature, the inner ear balance system, the proprioception, the whole physical envelope will develop under conditions that the species did not evolve inside. It is not clear, today, what such a person will look like, or what their physical capabilities will be. There is no operational data, because no human has ever been raised in partial gravity. There are reasonable predictions based on the responses of adult bodies to long durations of microgravity, and on the broader principles of developmental physiology, but the actual outcome will only be known when there are actual children born to actual settlers on the actual surface of the next world. It is reasonable to expect that a person raised entirely in the lower gravity might find a visit to the home world physically exhausting. They might find the air uncomfortably thick, the sunlight uncomfortably bright, the weather uncomfortably variable. They might experience the simple act of standing, walking, and carrying things at home-world gravity as a slow, continuous strain that they had never imagined. They might never visit the home world at all. They might live their entire lives on the surface of the next world, with the home world as a small, bright point in the sky that their parents and grandparents came from, but that they themselves have never touched. This is not, in the catalogue sense, a brutality, in the same way the radiation or the thin atmosphere is a brutality. It is a kind of change. It is a kind of becoming. The first generations born on the next world will be human, and they will carry everything that being human means, but they will also be something new. They will be the first generation of people for whom another planet is not a destination, not an achievement, not a project, but simply home. What kind of culture will grow up around them is, today, almost entirely unknown. What language they will speak, what habits of mind they will develop, what relationship they will have with the geography of their surface, the strange light of their sky, the slow, gentle pull of their lower gravity, the long arcs of their longer years. All of this is a question for the future. It cannot be answered now. It will be answered slowly, by the people who actually live it. There is also, at the farthest horizon, the question of terraforming. The deliberate transformation of the next world into a place with a thicker atmosphere, surface liquid water, and temperatures compatible with unprotected human habitation. It is a question worth touching on briefly because it sits at the edge of the brutality catalogue and gives a sense of the timescales on which the brutality might, in some far future, be reduced. The physics of warming the planet is understood at a basic level. There is frozen carbon dioxide at the polar caps and possibly in the soil. Warming the planet enough to vaporize that frozen carbon dioxide would thicken the atmosphere. More atmosphere would mean more greenhouse warming, which would melt more ice, which would thicken the atmosphere further, in a slow, self-reinforcing cycle. There are proposals for initiating that warming. Large mirrors placed in orbit around the planet to focus additional sunlight onto the polar caps. Powerful greenhouse gases introduced into the atmosphere from manufactured sources. Volatile-rich comets or asteroids redirected to impact the surface and deliver gases and water from the outer solar system. Each of these proposals has been carefully studied. None of them has been shown to be physically impossible in principle. The problem is not impossibility. The problem is scale and time. The energy and mass involved in any of these proposals are staggering. The timescales, even under the most optimistic assumptions, are measured in thousands of years for any meaningful surface transformation. There is also the underlying obstacle that without a planetary magnetic field, any thickened atmosphere would gradually be stripped away again by the same solar wind that thinned the original one. There are proposals for placing an artificial magnetic dipole in space between the next world and the Sun, deflecting enough of the solar wind to allow a thickened atmosphere to persist over geological time, but those proposals are far beyond any near-term engineering program. Terraforming, in honest terms, is not a solution to the brutality of the next world in any timescale that matters to anyone alive today, or to their children, or to their grandchildren. It is a context for thinking about the very long arc of humanity's possible relationship with the planet. It is not a near-term plan. It does not change what the first crews will face. It is only a reminder that even in the longest view, the brutality has shape, and the shape might in principle change over time, though not on any timescale that comforts the people who have to walk through it now. That is the brutality reserved for the future. The catalogue is nearly complete. There is one more piece, and it is the piece that reframes the rest. There are some additional details about the deep story of the planet that are worth sitting with quietly, because they show how every layer of the brutality is rooted in something older than any human attempt to reach it. The next world's interior, as best as the orbital and surface seismic measurements can tell, is layered in the same general way as the home worlds, with a thin outer crust of rock, a thick, rocky mantle beneath that, and a core of mostly iron at the center. The core may be partially or wholly liquid, but the patterns of convection that once drove the global magnetic field appear to have largely stopped. The crust on the planet's surface is thicker than the home world's crust, and is divided not into the moving plates we have on the home world, but into a single, more rigid shell. There is, today, no active plate tectonics on the next world. The crust does not slowly recycle itself. The mountains that formed billions of years ago are largely still there, and the surface features carry their full history written on them, with very little erasure. This is part of why the surface of the next world preserves so much information. Ancient impact craters from the early bombardment of the inner solar system are still visible. Ancient riverbeds and lake beds, carved by water that no longer flows, still hold their shapes. Old volcanic mountains, some of them larger than any mountain on the home world, still stand. The planet is, in a real sense, a museum of its own deep past. The rovers walking through it today are walking through a record of conditions that vanished billions of years ago. The largest volcanic mountain on the planet, the Great Shield volcano that rises above the surrounding plains, is roughly 2.5 times the height of the highest mountain on the home world. It is wider than the entire span of one of the larger islands of the home world. It is so large that, standing on its summit, the curvature of the planet would carry its lower slopes below the horizon. It is also, today, dormant. The volcanic activity that built it has long since slowed. The mountain stands as a monument to a phase of the planet's life that is now over. There is also a vast canyon system, longer than the breadth of one of the continents of the home world, deep enough that the home world's tallest mountains could be set into it without their peaks reaching the rim. The canyon was carved not by water, as the largest canyons on the home world were, but by the slow stretching and faulting of the surface as the planet's crust cooled and deformed billions of years ago. The canyon, like the great volcano, is a record of forces that have since slowed. The planet's 2 small moons, irregular and potato-shaped, may once have been asteroids captured into orbit by the planet's gravity, or maybe the remnants of an ancient collision. They orbit close to the planet, one of them so close that it will eventually, over millions of years, spiral inward and either crash into the surface or break apart into a temporary ring. The other moon orbits more slowly and is gradually drifting outward, very much as the home world's own moon is gradually drifting outward from the home world. Both of those slow processes, the inward fall of the closer moon and the outward drift of the farther one, are written in the patient calculations of orbital mechanics. They will play out long after any of us are here to watch. There is, finally, the question of life. Whether the warm, wet, ancient version of the planet ever hosted living organisms is one of the most carefully studied open questions in modern science. The rovers have looked for signs. The sample collecting mission has cached carefully chosen pieces of rock from sediments that, on the home world, would be the kind of places where the chemical traces of ancient microbial life might be preserved. The long, careful retrieval and analysis of those samples is one of the most anticipated scientific efforts of the coming decade. If the answer turns out to be yes, if the next world once held its own simple life, the implications for the human understanding of life in the universe will be substantial. It will tell us that life is not a one-off accident on the home world, but a process that begins wherever the conditions allow. It will also raise serious ethical questions for any future colonization effort about how to handle the introduction of biology from the home world to a place that has its own deep biological history, even if that history is now silent. If the answer turns out to be no, that too will tell us something important. It will tell us that even with liquid water, an atmosphere, energy sources, and the necessary chemistry, life is not automatic. It needs more than a hospitable environment. It needs the right initial step, the right sequence of conditions, the right slow building of complexity. That, too, would shape our understanding of where we sit in the larger picture. Either answer would change how we think about what the colony, when it grows, would represent. Either answer would change how we think about ourselves. These are deep questions, and they are not the brutality of the next world in the same way the radiation or the thin atmosphere is the brutality. But they are part of the long shape of what reaching the next world will mean. They are part of why the work matters, beyond the immediate engineering of getting a crew safely there and back. That is the slow context. The catalogue tonight has been about the hard, immediate engineering and biological challenges. The deep questions sit underneath all of them, waiting, as they have always waited, for the patient work of the coming decades. Part 8. The Brutality Reconsidered. There is a way of looking at all of this that does not soften the facts, but reframes their meaning. The brutality is real. It is not exaggerated. Each item in the catalogue is a measured, specific consequence of physics and biology and the long history of the planet. Nothing tonight has been embellished. The next world out is, in every category we have walked through, exactly as hostile as it appears. And yet, knowing all of this in detail is not, in the end, a source of dread. It is a source of clarity. The reasons no human has yet stood on the surface of the next world are not, as is sometimes supposed, a matter of insufficient ambition, or insufficient funding, or insufficient political will. The reasons are far more specific than that, and far more honest. The reasons are the items in the catalogue we have walked through tonight. Each one is a measurable engineering, or scientific, or human problem. Each one is being worked on, right now, by serious people in laboratories and test facilities and quiet offices across the home world. The engineers testing the landing systems that will eventually decelerate large payloads through the thin Martian atmosphere are real. Their test flights, with their slow, careful iterations, are real. The scientists studying spaceflight physiology and developing countermeasures to bone loss and muscle atrophy and radiation damage are real. Their experiments aboard the orbital station and on the ground are real. The researchers designing closed-loop life support systems that recycle water and air with progressively higher efficiency are real. Their slow gains in efficiency, year by year, are real. The geologists analyzing orbital data to understand the structure and chemistry of the Martian subsurface are real. Their identification of buried water ice deposits, of candidate lava tube openings, of safe landing sites with reachable resources is real. The nuclear engineers developing compact fission reactors for space power applications are real. Their successful ground tests, the slow, careful regulatory work, the careful safety analysis are real. The medical researchers designing remote surgical assistance and automated diagnostic tools for isolated crews are real. Their progress is real. Each of these threads of work is advancing. The picture they are building, collectively, is the picture of a problem that is extremely hard, but not permanently beyond reach. What is actually preventing humans from colonizing the next world is not a single obstacle that a single breakthrough would remove. It is the intersection of many specific physics-constrained and biology-determined challenges that must all be solved simultaneously, for a crew operating in isolation, with no outside help and no margin for critical failure. That is the honest shape of the problem. And there is something quietly remarkable about that honest shape. It means that progress on the next world problem is necessarily plural. It is not waiting on one heroic invention. It is being made in many places at once, across many disciplines, by many people, each contributing one carefully measured part of the larger answer. The arrival of the first human crew on the next world will be, when it happens, the convergence of decades of slow, patient work on every one of the items in tonight's catalogue. It is also worth noting, for completeness, that the brutality is not new. Every previous step humanity has taken outward has been into territory that, at the time of the step, looked impossibly hostile. When the first humans paddled small rafts across open ocean to reach islands beyond the horizon, the open ocean was a brutal environment. There was no rescue. There was no resupply. There was no navigation aid more sophisticated than the stars and the patterns of swell. The first crossings were one-way commitments into the unknown. People died on those crossings. people also arrived, settled new lands, and built lives that lasted for generations. When the first long-distance sailing expeditions crossed the great oceans, they did so in vessels that we would today regard as dangerously crude, in conditions that we would today regard as unacceptable. They lost ships. They lost crews. They also reached new continents and changed the shape of the human world. When the first balloons and the first aircraft were tested, the people in them were going into an environment that the human body had no business inhabiting. They did so with tools that were experimental, with theory that was incomplete, and with consequences that were sometimes fatal. They also opened a third dimension of human movement that nothing in our prior history had imagined. When the first crewed spacecraft left the homeworld's atmosphere, the people inside them were going into an environment that, on any honest accounting, was even more hostile than the surface of the next world out. The pressure outside the spacecraft was zero. The radiation environment was unfamiliar. The temperature differential between sunlit and shadowed surfaces was extreme. Yet, the missions flew. The early crews returned. The orbital programs that followed have, over decades, accumulated the knowledge and the operational discipline that the next outward step will depend on. The pattern is consistent. Each outward step has, in advance, looked impossible to many serious observers. Each outward step has been made by serious people, working slowly through the specific physical problems. Each successful crossing has expanded what later generations regard as ordinary. The next world out is harder than any previous step. It is also being approached with more knowledge, more technology, more international involvement, and more institutional momentum than any previous outward step has had at its starting line. There is a category of work that has accelerated the picture dramatically in the past decade or two. The private development of large, reusable launch vehicles, particularly the system designed explicitly around the economics of large, repeated cargo delivery to the next world, has changed what is structurally possible in a way that was not true 20 years ago. The relevant vehicle is not designed for a single dramatic mission. It is designed for sustained cargo flow. If it works as designed and is produced in the numbers its developers envision, the per-kilogram cost of delivering payload to the surface of the next world would fall dramatically below any historical benchmark. That cost reduction is what makes the economics of large-scale, long-term presence, at least theoretically, tractable in a way that was not previously the case. Other national programs have also stepped into the picture. The robotic exploration of the next world is no longer the province of a single agency. A growing number of countries now operate orbiters, landers, or rovers at the next world, and several have signaled long-range planning for crewed missions of their own. The proliferation of national programs does not directly solve the engineering challenges of human colonization. It does build the global knowledge base, develop the engineering expertise, and establish the institutional momentum that makes the eventual crewed missions more likely to succeed. There is also the question of the moon. The lunar surface plays a specific, practical role in the path to the next world that is sometimes misunderstood as a political distraction. The reality is more nuanced. Landing on the lunar surface and returning to orbit involves many of the same engineering elements as a landing on the next world: precision guidance, propulsion management, thermal control, dust mitigation, partial gravity operations. Practicing and refining those capabilities in a location 3 days from the home world, where an emergency abort can return a crew within days, is genuinely valuable compared to attempting all of those skills for the first time at the next world, where no abort is possible. The lunar surface is also a useful place to test some of the in-situ resource utilization technologies the next world will require. The Moon has water ice in permanently shadowed craters near its poles. Extracting that ice, splitting it electrically, and using the oxygen for breathing or for propellant is the same chemistry chain that the next world will require, tested in a place where the consequences of a partial failure are recoverable. Similarly, the physiological countermeasures, the suit technologies, and the life support systems being developed for lunar surface operations will, with modifications, be directly applicable to the next world. The Moon cannot serve as a physical stepping stone in the logistical sense. Infrastructure built on the lunar surface cannot be moved to the next world, but as a test environment, as a development platform, and as a way of sustaining institutional knowledge and operational culture across the decades required to develop next world-specific capabilities, the Moon is a quietly important part of the picture. The honest assessment of where matters stand, in summary, is this. There is not yet a tested, reliable human-scale landing system for the surface of the next world. There is not yet verified in-situ resource production at the scale required for crew survival and return. There is not yet a demonstrated ability to maintain human health over the combined crossing plus stay duration of a mission. There is not yet a closed-loop life support system that has operated reliably at the required scale in a relevant environment for the required duration. Each of these statements represents a genuine specific engineering or scientific gap. Not a gap in ambition, and not necessarily a gap in funding. A gap in demonstrated verified capability. This is not pessimism. It is precision. It is the careful accounting that serious mission planners do every day, in quiet offices on the home world, while they work toward the day when each of those gaps has been closed. And it is worth pausing, near the end of the catalogue, to imagine what it will be like when the gaps do close. A crew of perhaps 4 people will lift off the surface of the home world in a large vehicle of the kind being developed now. They will spend a few minutes ascending through the atmosphere. They will spend a few weeks or months in the homeworld's orbit, completing the final preparations and rendezvous operations for their crossing. They will then depart on the outbound trajectory for the next world. They will spend 6 to 9 months coasting along the long arc between the planets. They will exercise. They will eat. They will sleep. They will read and watch and think. They will talk to family back home through the slow, delayed messages. They will look out their small windows at the gradually changing perspective on the home world and the sun and the slowly approaching disk of the next world. They will arrive. They will descend. They will land. They will spend a few days getting used to the lower gravity, the new sky, the strange light. They will begin their work. They will conduct experiments, set up equipment, explore on foot the immediate area around the habitat, photograph and document, and sample the landscape around them. They will fall into a rhythm. They will live through the 500 days of the surface stay. They will watch the seasons of the next world pass over the long alien landscape outside their windows. They will see the polar caps grow and shrink. They will see the local dust storms rise and settle. They will see, when they are willing to stop and look, the small, bright blue point of the home world climb above the horizon in the pre-dawn or evening sky, and they will know, in a way no human has yet known, what it means for everyone they have ever loved to be on that point. At the end of the stay, they will launch from the surface. They will rendezvous in orbit with their return vehicle. They will spend another 6 to 9 months coasting back across the long arc between the planets. They will arrive. They will land on the home world. They will be, when they walk out into the air, the first human beings who have stood on another world that has its own weather, its own seasons, its own long history of being a planet rather than a moon. That is what success will look like. It is not glamorous. It is not fast. It is not dramatic in the moment-by-moment way the popular imagination sometimes suggests. It is slow and patient and physically taxing and psychologically demanding and scientifically rich and, in the end, extraordinary. The brutality is real. The work is real. The progress is real. The path is long. It is being walked, right now, by people whose names will appear in the histories of the next century, working in quiet offices and laboratories and test stands across the home world, on the slow, patient business of closing each gap in the catalogue. And somewhere, far ahead of us, in a year not yet on any calendar, someone will step out of an airlock into the cold, thin, pink-orange morning of the next world and look down at a patch of dust that has not been disturbed for billions of years, and that single quiet step will be the answer to every problem in tonight's catalogue. Not the dissolution of the brutality. The brutality will still be there. Simply, this time, the brutality, after all of its long, honest reasons, did not prevent the step. That is what is brutal about the next world. That is also what is hopeful about it. You have followed the catalogue with quiet attention. None of its items requires you to carry it. The next world will be cold and thin and dry and bright with red dust tomorrow, exactly as it is tonight. The work being done to reach it will go on whether you sleep through it or not. And the long, patient story of humanity's slow outward step into the rest of the solar system will continue, one quiet, careful piece of engineering at a time, regardless of whether anyone is watching at this particular hour. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders settle. Let the catalogue drift back into the background where it has always been. The brutality of the next world is real, and it is also far away, and it does not need anything from you tonight. The first human footprint on the next world will, when it finally lands, be extraordinary. What comes after it is what will matter most. The colony, the long, quiet work of making a habitat into a home, the generations born on a world their parents had to wear a suit to step out into, the slow, patient transformation of a place that was uninhabitable into a place that, for some small group of human beings, is simply where they live. That arc is measured in centuries, not in missions. It begins, gently, with the work being done right now. And so we leave the next world out where we found it tonight. Cold, thin-aired, patient, waiting for the first quiet footsteps that may or may not come within our lifetimes. The brutality is real. It will still be there in the morning, exactly as it has been for billions of years. None of it is something you need to carry tonight. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade. Sleep well and good night.